Good afternoon and welcome to this session, this sort of graveyard session really, on embedding diversity in corporate strategy and culture. My name is Louise Davidson and I'm the CEO of the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. So our panel today is going to look at diversity from a number of different angles. We're going to explore why diversity is an important investment issue and the value that diversity brings to organisations. We're also going to look at some of the challenges to building diversity, and in this era of Me Too, we'll talk about how important it is in building diversity for workplaces to make sure that their workforce is assured of respect and safety. Diversity obviously is a broad term. I think from an investor perspective that the ultimate aim is to ensure diversity of thought, and encouraging companies to include diversity of gender and ethnicity in their leadership is a key starting point for achieving this. And before we get to the panel discussion, I want to start with a positive story of the way that an investor focus on diversity can yield positive change. In Australia, our superannuation fund members have had a focus on gender diversity, and we've seen that investors have the opportunity to drive significant change by setting targets and by being prepared to back up company engagement with voting. In 2015, we set a target that all company boards in the top 200 companies in Australia should have 30% women. And at the time, I wrote to all of the boards that had 1 or 0 women on them. And I was somewhat dismayed to discover that I had to send 100 letters. So half of our target was in the situation of having only 1 or 0 women on them. But I have to say that setting a target has been a turning point and very helpful in driving change. So initially we engaged with companies about the target, and then with plenty of notice, we started recommending to our members that they should vote against the re-election of male directors on boards that had no women. And this has certainly focused boards on our agenda. When we started this process in 2015, there were 36 companies in the top 200 without a single woman on their board. Today there are only 3 companies, and 2 of those are expected to make appointments by the end of this calendar year. Now in Australia, over 28% of directors on the boards of the largest 200 companies are women, and 46% of appointments this year to boards have been women. Next, we're going to turn our attention to those boards that only have 1 woman. So now let's begin our panel discussion, and joining me on the stage today is a panel that is extremely well placed to discuss this topic. We have Sebastien Thevoux, ESG Analyst and Portfolio Manager at Comgest, Priya Mathur, the Chair of CalPERS, John Hoeppner, who is from LGIMA, and we have Consuelo Escorcia, who some of you will have seen in the last session, a hospitality worker and representative of Unite Here. And Consuelo is having her translation done by Cynthia. So to start off, to set the scene, I really wanted to ask each of our panel members how they define diversity. And we might just start with you, I think, Sebastien.
Sure. So when you say diversity, actually I hear really 2 dimensions. One being the ethical component that we all think of about fairness and justice, equal opportunities, and then there is the other one, the one which is maybe more economic, and where we all think about the performances that can be derived from having a diverse set of people. Most people do not take the time maybe to disentangle the 2, but I think it may be a bit worthwhile to do it. But before, maybe to think about what diversity truly is, we could take a step back and look at the etymology of the word, because it comes from Latin, and in Latin, diversitas really means diversion. It can be translated in many instances as contradiction, a kind of divergence of view or from the norm. And I think it is important because it is really something which is in motion. It's not about the state of being different. So that being said, I think that for a lot of people, for quite some time, diversity has been really something of an ethical issue. And after some academic research, we moved to this cognitive diversity bounty, which is supposed to really help people and teams to be more creative. And all of a sudden, even a cynic about the ethical component could be tempted to embrace that kind of diversity bonus. But I think it would be maybe a bit too simplistic to see those two things as separate, because what people tend to forget is that the diversity bonus, and here I'm using the title of a book by Scott Page, and I would recommend everyone in the room to read that book if you really want to get into all the details and facets of that diversity benefit in terms of economic performances. In those performances about innovation, creativity, and so on and so forth, can only be harvested if there are a few conditions being met. And first, it really works for problems that are really hard, complex, usually forward-looking, where information is a bit uncertain and definitely incomplete. By the way, when we think of the finance industry, we are totally in that kind of problem-solving situation, and despite that, we are suffering quite a bit when it comes to diversity. So, when you have that kind of problems, then the few conditions that you really want to see being met are to have a lot of communications, a lot of interactions within the group. Then what you want to have is people giving their best, so you want them to be engaged. You have to have a kind of aggregation mechanism, the Darwinian selection process, to really get the best out of everyone through those interactions. But if you want people to be engaged, if you want them to give their best, you have to have a kind of fairness in the way that process is being implemented. You have to have a kind of empathy and respect, an inclusive mindset in that group. So what I'm trying to convey briefly here is that you cannot separate the two. On the one hand, the ethical component, and on the other hand, the economic benefits that can be derived from cognitive diversity. Because if you have a diverse set of people who are not sharing that inclusive mindset of fairness and that true sense of having the right to speak up without fear, then you will miss those economic benefits.
Okay, does that ring true to you, Priya?
So I think we come at it from a slightly different angle, although I don't know that it's incompatible with what Sebastien has said. First, before I begin my remarks, I have to give a standard disclaimer that the views I express are my own and not necessarily those of CalPERS, its board, or the rest of, or the executive team. We actually have spent quite a bit of time defining what diversity means, and we've done it in our, what we call our governance and sustainability principles that cross the entire investment portfolio. And they state that board diversity should be thought of in terms of skills, gender, age, nationality, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and historically underrepresented groups. And that's important because that is, that covers sort of all of the aspects of society and the perspectives, experience, and skills that are necessary to really bring a diverse set of thoughts and ideas to the forefront. We also say that the consideration should go beyond the traditional notion of diversity to include, as I said, a broader range of experience, thoughts, perspectives, and competencies to help enable effective board leadership. Now this is both, the way we engage with diversity is both in terms of corporate boards and their composition, but also within our own investment managers and internally as well. We look to ourselves and continually work to improve our own diversity. Now I say that's how we define diversity, but how do we execute on this goal of having diverse corporate boards? There isn't the data out there on gender, or well, maybe on gender, but not on age, nationality, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and historically underrepresented groups. And in fact, you know, CalPERS is a global investor, and in some markets, it might be dangerous for that information to be publicly available or disclosed. And so what we have used in our engagement efforts as a proxy is gender, which is the easiest one to identify. But then in the actual engagements, we define diversity more broadly. So we identify our targets by focusing on gender, but the actual engagement activities are much broader.
Thank you. John.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here and humbled. I really, really have thought a lot about diversity and what is it that how does legal in general approach this, and how do I personally approach this? And let me start with a quick personal story. I did what everyone does when they get invited to an amazing panel, is I reached out to my peer group, and I reached out to my mentors, and I said, what does diversity mean to you? And how do you think about diversity? And frankly, the answers I got back were quite reflective. This group that I reached out to, if I were to be blunt, were all white males who were privileged and went to the same school. And all of them gave me the same answer, pretty much, which was, what's the proof? You gotta really hit them with the analytical proof that diversity creates an outperformance financially. And that was a really, really interesting answer to get back and to think about. And because there's, you know, all these framing bias that we walk into. We just voted in the room next door that 63% of us we thought that the companies were going off the tracks. And that made me think, you know, there's all sorts of bias of where we come from. And so I reflected a lot on that. And when I think about, and I think that's a really interesting question for all of us, when you guys think, what's the proof? How you approach that question around diversity, I think, is really telling of where we are in kind of our journey. From a legal and general perspective, we define diversity. Our goal is cognitive diversity of boards. And that's a really limited view. Diversity, big D diversity, is something that's embedded into all sorts of corporate strategy. It's embedded into their products, it's embedded into their customers, it's embedded into their suppliers. But as an investment manager, we have to be really focused on what diversity can we really influence and impact. So similar to what Priya mentioned, we focus on board diversity, we focus on executive management diversity, and broader management kind of below executives, where we see a lot of proof that when you have influence at the management level, it actually changes culture. From a proof point of view, because that was, you know, really what pushed me, you know, we have ample evidence around diverse groups making better decisions, challenging each other, making more creative decisions, so that, you know, we feel really confident that there's the investment side behind this. This is not done from an ethical perspective. We're primarily a long-term passive investor, so we're really thinking about this as an investment advantage over the long term for companies that add diversity.
Okay, I'm glad to see that there's some disagreement amongst our panel members, and maybe we'll come back to that if we have time. Consuelo, what does diversity mean to you?
La diversidad para mí es diferentes, que tenemos diferentes clases de lo que sea personas o razas.
Diversity for me means having different types of people, whether what we're talking about are individual people or different races or different types of people.
Thank you. Okay, thanks to all of our panel members. I'm going to ask the investors on the panel now just to give us some insights into what they see as being the major challenges for investors in considering investment diversity as part of your investment program. And we might reverse the order this time and start with you, John.
Sure. We see broadly three main challenges to more acceptance of diversity. The first is around a mindset of again, I'm speaking primarily around corporate boards or corporate executives, where we have the most influence. And from a mindset point of view, it's this perspective that this is an ethical decision, not a strategic decision. So that's kind of the first major pillar. The second pillar is data. Priya mentioned this, that we primarily rely on gender data to reflect broader diversity data. There's all sorts of ethical reasons why we have to do that, but that is a challenge. And as an investment manager, we're always looking for better data. So for those of you out there who have businesses that are in that space, come talk to us. That's something we want to see more of appropriately, but that is just a challenge of the industry. And the third pillar that we see that's the challenge is time horizon. Of course, everyone would love to make very direct, show me the proof, quarter to quarter, we changed the makeup of the board and they made better decisions. It's not that simple. So a more long-term oriented perspective is one of the major challenges.
Priya?
So maybe a little later we'll get into some of the actual initiatives that CalPERS has embarked upon. But one of the big issues, excuse me, sorry, there was a little fly in front of me. One of the big issues is really the tenure on boards. And that tenure has actually been getting, at least in the United States, been getting longer and longer. And the retirement age of board members has been getting higher and higher. And so while we have done quite a number of things to try to address the supply side of the issue around diversity, the challenge has been actually having enough board seats open up in order to place or vote in new, more diverse talent on these boards. So some of the things that also contribute to that are a lack of majority voting at many companies that allow us as investors, as share owners, to hold boards accountable and enable us to refresh the board. And proxy access is a similar or related issue where we don't actually, at many companies, have the ability to run candidates that we think would be well qualified and represent diverse perspectives for the board. Disclosure remains an issue, and there's very inconsistent disclosure across companies. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, disclosure is really only around a gender dimension, and it's harder to get information that's credible on other dimensions, that's comparable across companies. So I think those are the biggest challenges that we see with respect to diversity.
Thank you. And Sebastien?
Yeah, and when you ask what are the challenges for investors to really consider diversity as part of their investment process, I would say that, let's face it, there is one big lack of credibility when investors look at themselves and are trying to understand what diversity could bring on the table, or when they are engaging with companies, because those companies would look at the people in front of them and they would see, as John said, male and pale people. If we take a step back and look at just a few numbers, here in the US, if you take all portfolio managers, and there are a couple of studies that are quite telling about it, actually only 9% of them are female. If you take the chief investment officers in this industry, 6% are female. And if you think it is trending up, actually it is trending down. Looking at 15 years ago, it was 13% of portfolio managers who were female, and 9% who were chief investment officers. Then, maybe taking another angle at that diversity topic, can anyone give a guess about the percentage of African American among portfolio managers? I was quite surprised myself. It's just 1.4%.
So you think that companies could rightly say to us, if it's so good and so important, why don't you guys do it yourselves?
And again, all the more if you think that investment is about problem solving, very hard, complex, forward-looking, with uncertain and incomplete information. I mean, this is quite nonsense not to be able to promote internally more diverse teams. And then another challenge would be that actually we tend to see diversity as not that big a problem maybe to assess or to understand, but based on many examples of companies with which Comgest has been engaged and looking at what they have been going through. Of course, you can have a few numbers to make a guess about how things are progressing, like women on board or women in management. But most of the time, actually, the devil is really in the details. And I think that the pay-gender gap is much more useful when you really want to assess that ethical component and this inclusive mindset and to guess if it's there or not. Because you can have a nice policy, you can have like the right amount of women on board, but if you don't have the processes, if you don't have the trainings, just to make people aware of all those unconscious biases that there are, actually, you may have a sense things are getting better when they are not changing at all.
Can I actually add one other thing? And that is just the nature of networking, is that I think what we have seen a lot on corporate boards is that one CEO sits on his friend's board, and his friend sits on his board, and there's just this very small, narrow universe where they're talking to each other. And so they say, oh, I don't see the talent out there. I don't see the diverse talent. And it's because maybe they don't know where to look, or they're just not in the right circles. But I think that is also an impediment. And it's something we've tried to address. CalPERS and CalSTRS together launched this diverse director data source, which was really intended to address the supply side and allow diverse individuals to self-identify as being interested in board seats and list their qualifications, et cetera. And we haven't seen as great take-up as we would have liked.
Do you mean take-up by people volunteering or companies?
By corporate boards.
Okay.
We have it's a fairly sizable database. It's now being managed or been taken over by Equilar. But I think we're getting some traction now. But really, there hasn't been a desire to go outside of their own circle.
Yeah, I think that's certainly something we're thinking about in Australia is, in addition to driving gender diversity, how can we also increase the diversity of background of people going onto boards? Because there is a concern, I think, that a lot of directors live in what I would describe as a bit of a bubble. And they all talk to the same people, they have very similar kind of life patterns, they live in the same suburbs, and that's perhaps not very helpful for diversity of thought and decision making. Priya, you've mentioned the diversity database, but I know that CalPERS has been looking at diversity as a governance issue for quite some time. Are you able to tell us a bit more about some of the various issues that you've been dealing with over the last couple of years in terms of policy development, trying to influence policy development, and also the implementation of diversity in your portfolio?
Yes, so CalPERS has been focusing on diversity for quite a number of years, but just a couple of years ago we adopted our 5-year ESG plan, and we identified 6 priorities, one of them being diversity. And since 2016, when around the time we adopted this plan, we have jointly with CalSTRS engaged about 87 publicly listed California companies which had no women on their boards. Of these, about 23 of these companies have since added at least one woman to their boards. But we also last summer sent letters to 500 companies listed in the United States that in the Russell 3000, asking them to address their lack of gender diversity on their boards. As I said, again, gender diversity was the metric that we used to identify the companies, but we actually asked them to talk about all different aspects of diversity and what their plan is to improve. We've received responses from about half, so about 250, 300 companies. 90 of those companies, or about 18%, have added or in the process of adding a female director. And 155 companies, or 31%, said that they have enhanced or in the process of enhancing their diversity disclosure. 7 companies had totally inadequate responses. Now, what we're what we're doing now is engaging companies both privately and confidentially on their diversity. So we're taking another stab at those companies that we have that we sent letters to who didn't respond or who didn't adequately respond, and to see if we can get more traction and gain some momentum with them. If not, then we will take further steps in engagement. And majority voting is clearly top of the agenda to ensure that we actually can refresh these boards as needed and gain investor support for those further engagement actions, proxy voting actions.
Okay. John and Sebastien, I thought I might just bring you in here to talk about what you think have been the most successful strategies in your observation in driving diversity as an investment issue, and perhaps also touch on the role of collaboration in that process. And I guess, Sebastien, you're going to come back to this point that, actually walking the walk would be helpful as an industry. So.
Yeah, sure. So, actually, I have a little confession to make. And I'm using the opportunity that the Chief Compliance Officer of Comgest is not in the room, because she would be maybe severing the head from the rest of my body if she were there. But actually, 5 years ago, I joined Comgest, and I was extremely excited for a couple of reasons. And one being that, and please keep in mind that past performances are no guarantee for the future, but the track record was pretty astonishing over 25 years. And I thought that I was joining a team who had something of a silver bullet, a kind of recipe for successful investing. And during the first few weeks, I met with all the members of the investment team, bombarding them with questions. I sat on all research meetings, taking notes, and trying to understand what was this very special sauce that they had, maybe to beat the benchmarks for so many years. And after a couple of weeks, or even months, I was a bit frustrated, to be totally honest. Yes, they were talented, but were they that much more talented that so many people have met previously? Yes, they were working pretty hard, but were they working that much harder? And then I looked at them again, and what I realized quite strikingly was how diverse this team can be. And maybe just a couple of numbers. I think that if we just take the Paris team of Comgest, we are 26 people. There are 11 women in that team, so it should be more than 40% of the members who are female. Then, if I do remember well, out of those 26 people, there are actually 14 different nationalities. Since the French are by far a minority, we are 9, which for a French company is kind of astonishing. So what I try to say here is that if you want to drive a successful investment strategy on the merit or the benefits that you can gain through diversity, sometimes you can just look at some, either at yourself or maybe at some good examples. But I think that it was pretty easy maybe to make that case quite convincingly with a few companies as well. We have been shareholders, for instance, of Microsoft for 10 years. Now, not before 2008, but quite a bit after 2008. And it is clearly one of those companies that for at least 10 years had lost its ability to innovate. And if you look at it, it regained really that ability to innovate more or less when they really they started to reinvent their culture. And part of that journey was clearly related to diversity. They had a few initiatives starting from 2001 that went absolutely nowhere until 2012, until Steve Ballmer left. But if you take a few examples of companies that have managed to really reinvent themselves and maybe to reignite the engine of innovation through diversity and women in particular, in the case of Microsoft, then people are much more open to discuss that issue with companies, for instance.
Okay, thanks, John.
How I think about what's been the most successful strategy to driving diversity, without question, it has to be regulation. So we are not direct players of that, but when you look from market to market, so you look at the Nordics or you look at France and they set specific targets, what happens? Companies meet that target. And I don't think anyone here wants regulation to step over and set a target, but that is the most effective way. And we from Legal in General applaud California. Many of you may know had passed regulation, I think this week, maybe last week, to start fining companies that don't have women on the board of public companies. That's a really big step. And so what you will see is every company that will become the new bar. So that is the most effective way. And we as investment managers can of course influence that a little bit, but that's very indirect and it takes long term. From a direct point of view, diversity is part of our one-on-one direct engagements and part of our collaborative efforts. We're part of the 30% coalition. From a direct engagement point of view, I can give you an example. In 2012, Legal in General made a focused effort on UK public companies to drive diversity, again measured by females on the board. Just to give you some high-level numbers, in 2011, so this was before our efforts, the average percent of women on corporate boards was somewhere between 12 and 7%, whether you're talking about the largest 100 or the next largest 250. 6 years after a focused campaign, and that means direct engagement, guidance, clear objectives, and also the threat to vote against your chairman, which was instituted again right along 2012. Those numbers have risen to about 28%, 23 to 28%, depending on which side you look at. We were the first mainstream large asset manager to be public about that, and we're really proud of taking a leadership role. Since that point, we've rolled that out on a global basis, with a few exceptions in certain Asian countries that would mean in voting against all, and so we're working through the regulation. But there is success, so this actually does work, it just takes a long time.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of shift our focus a little bit now and talk about, I guess, some of the challenges within workforces to making sure that diversity is possible and supported. And I think it's an interesting time right now because we've seen a lot of examples of sexual and gender-related violence in the workplace revealed through the Me Too movement over the last 18 months. And they've ranged from Fox to Uber to Wynn Resorts. Consuelo, I would like to get your observations, your experience about sexual and gender-based violence in the workplace. What do you think that customers and investors need to know about the reality for workers in this industry?
Bueno, mi nombre es Consuelo Escorcia y trabajo aquí por 29 años. Yo soy un lobby attendant, limpio el lobby, los pasillos y todos los baños en las áreas públicas. De hecho, yo limpié los baños que ustedes están usando hoy.
My name is Consuelo Escorcia. I work as a lobby attendant here in the Marriott Marquis. I've worked here in this hotel for 29 years. As a lobby attendant, I clean the lobby, the bathrooms, the ballrooms, and all the bathrooms in the public areas. In fact, I cleaned the bathrooms that you are using today.
Mis compañeros y yo ayudamos a organizar la unión aquí hace 22 años. Fue una pelea larga y dura, pero luchamos y ganamos juntos, obtuvimos salarios, beneficios que nos permiten vivir con dignidad y una voz en el trabajo.
My coworkers and I helped to organize the union here 22 years ago. It was a long, hard fought, but we fought and we won. Together, we got salaries and benefits that allow us to live with dignity and a voice on the job.
Pero todavía tenemos problemas. El costo de la vida en San Francisco ha aumentado rápidamente y también ha subido la renta, pero nuestros salarios no han seguido el mismo ritmo. Cada vez es más difícil llegar a fin de mes con un solo trabajo.
But we still have problems. The cost of living has increased quickly, as well as rent, but our wages have stayed the same. We cannot get by with just one job.
La seguridad en el lugar de trabajo es una preocupación especialmente urgente. El exceso de trabajo amenaza nuestra salud. Por ejemplo, hace 6 años me lastimé el hombro debido a las intensas demandas de mi trabajo y aún no me he recuperado por completo.
Safety is an urgent issue. The workloads are hard on our health. For example, 6 years ago I hurt my shoulder due to the intense workload, and I'm still not completely healed.
Y somos muy vulnerables al acoso sexual. Fui atacada mientras limpiaba un baño hace 3 años.
And we are vulnerable to sexual assault. 3 years ago I was attacked while cleaning the bathroom.
Marriott es la compañía hotelera más grande del mundo. Sus accionistas son las personas que asisten a estas conferencias. Por eso estoy aquí hoy.
Marriott is the biggest hotel company in the world. Its shareholders are attending this conference, and that's why I'm here today.
Tenemos muchas dificultades como un cargo de trabajo muy pesado, hasta problemas de salud, de seguridad y hasta el acoso sexual.
We have a lot of difficulties, including a very heavy workload, health problems, and including sexual assault.
El acoso sexual es un problema aquí. Lo experimenté por mí misma hace aproximadamente 3 años. Un sábado alrededor de las 6 de la mañana fui atacada sexualmente en mi lugar de trabajo.
Sexual assault is a problem here. I experienced it myself about 3 years ago. One Saturday around 6 a.m. I was sexually assaulted at work.
Estaba limpiando en un baño cuando un hombre me agarró por la cintura desde atrás, me empujó hacia atrás poniendo mis codos. Lo empujé poniendo mis codos contra él.
I was cleaning a bathroom when a man grabbed me from around my waist from behind, and I pushed back, pushing my elbows against him.
Estaba gritando, ayuda, ayuda, tan fuerte como podía. Él ya tenía los pantalones abajo y trató de bajar mis pantalones. Al fin mis compañeros de trabajo, Fully y Yasmi, me oyeron gritar y entraron.
I was yelling for help as loud as I could. He already had his pants down and was trying to pull down my pants. Finally, my coworkers, Fully and Hasmin, heard my yelling and came.
El hombre salió corriendo. Yo estaba llorando, estaba histérica, me sentía muy mal y hasta quería vomitar.
The man ran out. I was crying and I felt hysterical and I almost felt like vomiting.
Informé este ataque a la gerencia, pero la gerencia me decía que no hablara de esto. El silencio fue una de las peores cosas.
I told the managers about the attack and they told me not to talk about it.
Me sentí como que si me estuvieran acusando de algo malo, como si que lo que sucedió hubiera sido mi culpa. Me sentí deprimida, enojada, sin esperanza. Ellos no iban a hacer nada sobre esto.
The silence was the worst part. I felt as if they were accusing me of doing something wrong, as if it had been my fault. I felt depressed, angry, and hopeless. They weren't going to do anything about it.
Poco después, otro violento ataque sexual le sucedió a otra housekeeper que hasta el día de hoy no ha podido regresar a trabajar.
Soon after, another violent sexual assault happened to another housekeeper, and to this day she has not been able to return to work.
Es hora de que Marriott asuma las responsabilidades de estos terribles eventos y tome medidas para proteger a sus trabajadores.
It's time for Marriott to take responsibility for these terrible events and to take steps to protect their workers.
Thank you, Consuelo, for sharing that terrible story. Oh, sorry, have you still got some more?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Los dueños del medio tienen el poder de hacer mi trabajo seguro y mi compensación justa. Les pregunto, ¿cómo querían ellos que sus propias esposas y sus propias hijas fueran tratadas en sus trabajos?
Marriott's owners, its investors, have the power to make my job safer and my wages fair. And I ask you, how would you want your own wives and your daughters treated if they had my job?
Además, tenemos... Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very moving story, and a thank you, Consuelo, for having the courage to tell your story publicly. And I think as investors, we have to rise to the challenge that's been given to us. Priya, I know that you've been doing some work on how investors might respond to this type of story, so would you like to share that with us?
I would, actually. And while it's extraordinary and so brave that Consuelo is here with us to share this story, what we know is that this is not an extraordinary story. It is all too common in the hospitality industry. In fact, somewhere between 60 and 75% of hospitality workers report that they have been sexually harassed or accosted in the workplace. And that is just not okay. I mean, that is not something that we should, in my opinion, stand by and let continue. Now, one of the things that most investors probably are not aware of is that the structure of the hotel industry has changed dramatically in recent years. So while it used to be that there were owner-operators like Marriott and others, today most of those major global brands are actually operating under a more asset-light model, where they have sold off the actual properties to hospitality REITs or private equity funds. And many of us in this room own these hospitality franchises through those REITs and those private equity funds. So it really is in our portfolio. This behavior, this culture is embedded in our portfolio. In California, we have a California Trustee network that I'm very proud to say has started a couple of years ago. And when this issue came forward to this California Trustee network, the energy in the room changed. You know, we've all heard the stories of Wynn Industries where after several allegations regarding sexual misconduct against Steve Wynn, the founder and CEO, arose in January of 2018, we know that that company lost 18% of its value over a couple of days, about over $2 billion of shareholder value. Not only that, but this also invited various investigations and shareholder lawsuits and insider trading allegations, both of board members and the CFO. We know in today's market that the value of companies is less and less in tangible assets. In fact, Forbes reported just a year or so ago that about 80% of companies' value are intangibles, and included in that are reputation and brand. That is something that we as investors must be especially concerned about. So this is certainly a human issue, of course, but it is also a very tangible investment issue. So this California Trustee Network, and I'm joined by many of my colleagues in the room today, has come together to start to develop a toolkit for investors. That includes some framing comments and questions, which I have here in draft form, and we will share a little bit later. that talks about some of the material losses that have been experienced by companies and shareholders in the wake of allegations and information around sexual misconduct in the workplace, and some questions that we can ask of our own internal investment teams and of ourselves and of our external investment managers and consultants. We've also developed a draft policy that I will also share. CalPERS itself has adopted a policy around sexual misconduct and harassment in the workplace. We've incorporated it into our governance and sustainability principles, both in terms of corporate culture and the board's responsibility for establishing corporate culture and monitoring and governing and overseeing that culture and ensuring that it is not tolerant of this type of behavior, and also in terms of human capital management and the strategies that should be implemented to both protect workers and also enforce the policies within the company. We've also withheld a vote from a legacy director at Wynn Resorts for failing to appropriately oversee the risks surrounding harassment and misconduct at that company specifically. So this working group that I talked about, the California Trustee Network, is continuing to develop other tools. One of the things that we expect to be launching sometime in the coming months is an investor letter that we're hoping to get female trustees all across this country to sign on to, as well as other resources that can be shared and used by trustees and asset owners as we are taking on this issue as a real investment issue. So very proud of the work that we've done to date. It is certainly not the end of the journey. We have a lot of work left to do, and I invite everyone to join our efforts.
And Priya and I have discussed that we will approach the PRI to see if we can get this material put onto the PRI website so that other investors can access it once the drafting process is completed. I'd like to go to audience Q&A now because we only have a short time left together. We've got some roving mics, so if people would like to raise their hand, someone will come to you. And I just ask that you would say your name and the organisation that you represent at the start of your question, please. So down the front here.
I'm Tim Smith with Walden Asset Management based in Boston. And I just wanted to add a couple of points on the board diversity discussion, but first of all, wanted to very much thank Consuelo for her very moving testimony. It's very touching. I serve with a woman named Mary Morris from CalPERS as the co-chair of the investor committee of the 30% Coalition, and that's a group of investors and women's organizations working on board diversity including gender and race, of course. But we're just about to send out to our membership, which is investors of about $3 trillion, a list of companies that Mary has created from CalSTR's database of companies that have no women on the board or only one woman on the board. And we are the coalition is writing all of those companies, and then the United Auto Workers and others will be filing resolutions with some of those companies that have no board diversity. So I thought that would be of interest to the people in the room, and we can, through PRI, keep publicizing the companies where we have engaged them through resolutions. But in many, many cases, when we're writing companies and talking to them, we're, in contrast to 10 years ago where we got a rather disrespectful pushback, we're having more and more companies say they get the business case, they get the mandate to work on this, and within 6 months they've changed the composition of the board, at least with small steps. The last thing that I'd report on, which I think is an important ingredient here, and the panelists did refer to this, is how groups like the state of New York pension funds and the state of Massachusetts, the state of Rhode Island, I'll just mention those three, are voting against boards that don't have 30% of the board being women or people of color. So this is a pushback where directors are going to get no votes and be told their nominating committee is not doing their job when they are inadequately diverse. So I think that's an important ingredient in this increasing pushback. Thank you.
Thank you. Down the front here? Yes.
Hi, my name is Rosa Vandenbeemt with NEI Investments in Canada. Thank you all the panelists. I was wondering if some of you, but particularly Priya, could comment on best practices of company disclosure on diversity beyond gender, specifically underrepresented groups. Often when we're proxy voting, all that we can go off of are pictures and names, which is really not sufficient data. So I was wondering if you could point us to some better disclosure examples that you've seen.
I don't know that I can, actually. So I'm sorry, I'm not really the one who can answer your question. But yeah, I think it's a tricky area to get adequate disclosure on. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm Delaney Gregg with Share, also in Canada. And I have a quick comment and then a question. And the comment is perhaps a suggestion for the, when you're receiving the, well, what's the proof for the diversity case? I would argue that perhaps the response is, what's the proof for the all-white man case, which is not reflective of the population? And that perhaps if there was a requirement to demonstrate that that was materially better, it probably wouldn't provide proof. And then I have a question for Consuelo. If you could, so there's been a lot of talk, there's been a bill put forward in here by Senator Warren, and then there's discussion in the UK about having workers sit on company boards and boards of directors. And I was wondering how it might change your workplace and your company if workers were able to had a role in decisions about the company and had a voice in the leadership of the company.
Sería muy bueno, pero esta compañía no nos permitiría eso, porque este día lo comprobé, mis compañeros querían venir a apoyarme y los managers no los dejaron ni siquiera participar que vinieran conmigo a apoyarme. Pienso que es algo que sería como tan difícil para nosotros.
That would be very good, but Marriott would not let us. I experienced this myself just today. Some of my coworkers were going to come and sit with me to support me, and Marriott wouldn't let them.
You know, one of the issues here in the U.S. Following a recent Supreme Court decision is that now companies can impose forced arbitration on all their employees. This means that individual employees must face their employer by themselves, not in conjunction with other employees who suffered similar situations. And it makes it and they cannot form class action lawsuits. It makes it very difficult to advocate for your rights, for your safety, for improvements in the workplace if you're a solo individual all by yourself.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm sorry, but we're right out of time. It's a conversation that we could have spent quite a lot longer on. Before you go on your way, I think just two challenges really that have come out of this conversation from my perspective. The first really was Sebastien's challenge to us as an industry to really think a little more deeply about getting our own house in order on the diversity front. I don't think that should stop us from asking these questions of companies, but we do need to seriously think about what is failing in our own organisations to lead to the sort of statistics that you were quoting. And then, of course, the second challenge was from Consuelo. And again, I thank you, Consuelo, for sharing such a personal and moving story. And I think that as investors, we have to think about how we can step up to challenge companies, the companies that we own, to make sure that they're providing workplace safety to their workers and particularly to women within them. So thank you to all of our panel, and thank you.